Everyone thought Aimee Semple McPherson was dead. In 1926, after she vanished at the beach, search teams combed the ocean 4 days. Her clothes were found, but her body never was. The nation mourned. Newspapers declared her gone. Then suddenly, weeks later, she reappeared alive in the desert, claiming she had been kidnapped. But here's the question that still lingers nearly a century later. Was it a miracle escape, or one of the greatest mysteries in religious history? In this video, we uncover the untold story of Aimee Semple McPherson, her rise to fame, the miracles that drew thousands, and the disappearance that shocked the world. Before we dive in, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves powerful, real-life mysteries. Now, let's begin. In the early decades of the 20th century, when America was still discovering the power of radio, mass media, and modern evangelism, one woman rose to a level of influence that few religious leaders had ever achieved. Her name was Aimee Semple McPherson. To her followers, she was more than a preacher. She was a prophet, a healer, and a living symbol of divine power in a restless age. To her critics, she was something very different. They saw spectacle, drama, performance, and perhaps something even darker. But no one could deny the extraordinary impact she had on the religious landscape of the 1920s. Crowds came to see her from across the country. Thousands filled massive auditoriums. Newspapers followed her every move, and when she spoke, people listened. Yet the story of Aimee Semple McPherson is not simply a story of revival meetings and packed churches. It is also a story of mystery, a disappearance that stunned the nation, questions that remain unanswered even today, and a life that moved constantly between miracle and controversy. But before the mystery, before the headlines, before the rumors that would one day surround her name, there was a young girl with an unusual calling. She was born in 1890 in rural Ontario, Canada, into a deeply religious home. Her mother was an active member of the Salvation Army, and faith was woven into the very fabric of their daily lives. From a young age, Aimee was surrounded by preaching, singing, and evangelistic meetings. Yet despite this environment, she was not always convinced. As a teenager, she began questioning many of the religious beliefs she had grown up hearing. Like many young people encountering modern ideas for the first time, she became fascinated with new theories about science and evolution. She read widely, she debated, she challenged the faith of her childhood. For a time, it seemed that religion might fade from her life completely. But everything changed when she attended a revival meeting led by a young Pentecostal preacher, Robert James Semple. Semple preached with a fiery intensity that was impossible to ignore. His message was not merely intellectual. It was urgent, emotional, charged with the belief that God was still performing miracles just as he had in the pages of the Bible. During that meeting, something happened that Aimee would later describe as a turning point in her life. She felt what she believed was a powerful encounter with God. The skepticism that had once filled her mind began to dissolve. Faith replaced doubt, and in the weeks that followed, her life began moving in a direction she had never expected. She soon married Robert Semple, and together they committed themselves to missionary work. Their destination was China. At the time, missionary work required immense courage. Travel was long and dangerous, disease was common, and missionaries often lived in difficult conditions, far from home. But Aimee embraced the calling wholeheartedly. She believed she had found her purpose. In 1910, the young couple sailed across the Pacific to begin their mission. For Aimee, the journey was both thrilling and terrifying. She was barely 20 years old. She was far from home, and she was stepping into a world completely unfamiliar to her. The work was intense. They preached, they prayed. They shared their faith with local communities. But the challenges of missionary life soon became painfully clear. Only a few months after arriving in China, tragedy struck. Robert Semple contracted dysentery, a disease that was often deadly in that era. Despite desperate efforts to care for him, his condition worsened rapidly. Within weeks, he died. Aimee was suddenly alone in a foreign country. And she was pregnant. The loss devastated her. Her dreams of missionary work seemed shattered before they had even begun. Grief weighed heavily on her heart. Yet even in the midst of that grief, she believed that God still had a plan for her life. She returned to North America as a young widow with a newborn daughter. Most people would have expected her to retreat into a quiet life after such trauma. But Aimee Semple McPherson was not like most people. Something inside her refused to remain silent. She began speaking in small churches, then larger ones. Her messages carried a passionate intensity that captivated audiences. She spoke about faith, healing, the power of prayer, and the belief that God could intervene directly in the lives of ordinary people. Wherever she went, crowds began to grow. People claimed to experience miraculous healings during her meetings. Stories spread quickly, word traveled from town to town, and soon the gatherings were no longer small. They became enormous revival campaigns, in tents, in auditoriums, in open fields. People traveled long distances to attend. Some came seeking hope, others came out of curiosity, and some came simply because they had heard whispers of miracles. But Aimee understood something that many preachers of her time did not. She understood the power of communication. She used dramatic storytelling. She incorporated music. She staged illustrated sermons that brought biblical scenes to life. To many observers, it looked almost like theater, but to her followers, it was something else entirely. It was the gospel presented in a way that people could feel and understand. Her fame spread rapidly throughout the United States. By the early 1920s, she had become one of the most recognized religious figures in the country. And then she did something unprecedented. She built a massive church in Los Angeles. It was called Angelus Temple. The building could seat more than 5,000 people, week after week. It was filled to capacity. Services were broadcast on radio, reaching audiences far beyond the walls of the church. In many ways, Aimee Semple McPherson was pioneering a new form of mass evangelism, one that combined faith, media, and spectacle. Her supporters believed they were witnessing the work of God. Her critics believed they were watching the rise of religious celebrity. Both sides watched closely, because something unusual was happening. The woman who had once been a young missionary widow was now standing at the center of a rapidly growing religious movement. Her influence stretched across the nation. Her sermons reached millions, and stories of healing and miracles followed her everywhere she went. But the higher her fame rose, the more intense the scrutiny became. Journalists began asking difficult questions, skeptics challenged the claims of miracles, and whispers of controversy started appearing in newspaper columns. Still, none of those controversies could have prepared the nation for what would happen next. Because in 1926, at the height of her fame, Aimee Semple McPherson vanished. One moment, she was standing on a California beach. The next, she was gone. And the mystery of what happened would become one of the most sensational stories in American history. But to understand how that disappearance shocked an entire nation, we must first understand the extraordinary power and influence she had built. Because before the mystery, there were the miracles. By the mid-1920s, Aimee Semple McPherson had become something almost unheard of in American religious history. She was not just a preacher. She was a phenomenon. Everywhere she went, crowds followed. Entire cities seemed to pause when she arrived. Newspaper reporters attended her meetings alongside devoted believers, all hoping to witness something extraordinary. And often, they claimed they did. Stories of miraculous healings were becoming inseparable from her ministry. At revival meetings, people came forward describing illnesses that doctors had failed to cure. Some were blind, others claimed paralysis. Still others suffered from chronic diseases that had left them desperate for hope. Aimee would pray over them, sometimes placing her hands gently on their shoulders, sometimes commanding healing in a strong, confident voice. And then came the testimonies. A man claimed his hearing had returned. A woman stood up and declared she could walk without pain for the first time in years. Others wept openly, believing they had experienced a divine touch. These testimonies spread quickly. Supporters believed they were witnessing genuine miracles. Skeptics argued that emotion and suggestion could easily influence desperate people. But regardless of where someone stood, one fact was impossible to ignore. People kept coming, and the crowds kept growing. At the center of this growing movement stood Angelus Temple, the massive church she founded in Los Angeles. Angelus Temple became the headquarters of a movement known as the International Church of the Foursquare Gospel. The church was unlike anything any Americans had ever seen. It could hold more than 5,000 people. The architecture was grand, the services were carefully organized, and the atmosphere was electric. Inside the building, worship blended with dramatic presentation. Music filled the air, choirs sang with powerful intensity, and when Aimee stepped onto the platform, the room would fall into expectant silence. Her sermons were not delivered in a monotone voice. They were vivid, visual, often theatrical. She sometimes used props and costumes to illustrate biblical stories. In one famous sermon, she rode a motorcycle onto the stage to symbolize the urgency of spreading the gospel. In another, she recreated scenes from Scripture, using elaborate visual displays. To many observers, this approach seemed revolutionary. Religion had traditionally been formal and restrained. But Aimee understood something deeply important about human attention. People remembered stories. People responded to emotion. People engaged with drama. And she used those elements skillfully. Even critics admitted she was an extraordinary communicator. But her influence extended beyond the walls of Angelus Temple. She quickly recognized the power of emerging technology. In the early 1920s, radio was still a relatively new medium. Yet Aimee saw its potential immediately. She launched one of the earliest Christian radio stations in the country. Through broadcasts, her voice reached people who had never stepped inside her church. Families gathered around their radios to hear her sermons. Travelers listened from distant towns. And suddenly, her ministry was no longer limited by geography. It was national. In many ways, she had become one of the first true religious media personalities. But fame, especially religious fame, rarely arrives without criticism. Some ministers accused her of turning worship into entertainment. Others questioned the authenticity of the healings reported at her meetings. Medical professionals demanded evidence. Newspapers sometimes ran skeptical articles, suggesting that the miracles might be exaggerated. Yet the accusations seemed to have little effect on her popularity. If anything, the controversy only increased public interest. Curiosity drew even more people to her meetings. Some came hoping for a healing, others came to investigate. But many left convinced they had witnessed something extraordinary. Beyond the revival meetings, Aimee also showed deep concern for social issues. Angelus Temple was not only a place for worship, it became a center for charitable work. During difficult economic times, the church provided food and clothing for struggling families. Shelters were organized for people in need. Community programs reached thousands in Los Angeles. For many supporters, this was proof that her ministry was genuine. She was not simply preaching, she was serving. And her message often emphasized practical compassion. She spoke about helping the poor, caring for widows, supporting children who lacked basic necessities. These efforts helped build a loyal following. People felt that Angelus Temple was more than a church. It was a community. Yet despite the success, the intense pace of her life came with pressure. Aimee rarely slowed down. She preached multiple times each week. She traveled extensively for revival campaigns. She managed the growing administrative responsibilities of the Foursquare Church. She dealt with constant media attention, and she carried the expectations of thousands who believed she possessed a special spiritual gift. For someone already living under public scrutiny, that pressure could be overwhelming. Still, outwardly, she appeared unstoppable. Her sermons remained energetic, her meetings remained crowded, and her reputation as a healer continued spreading. By 1926, she had become one of the most recognizable religious figures in America. Her name appeared regularly in newspapers, photographs of her filled magazine pages. Reporters often described her as a blend of preacher, celebrity, and cultural force. But fame has a strange way of drawing both admiration and suspicion. And in Aimee's case, the attention surrounding her life was becoming increasingly intense. Some journalists began investigating her ministry more closely. They wanted to know whether the miracle stories were true. They questioned the financial structure of the church. They examined her personal life, and they watched her movements carefully. None of them knew that the story they were about to cover would become far more sensational than anything they had imagined. Because on a warm day in May 1926, something happened that would stop the entire nation in its tracks. Aimee Semple McPherson went to the beach. She often visited the ocean to rest and pray. That day seemed ordinary. Nothing suggested it would become historic. She walked toward the water. Witnesses later said she intended to swim. And then, she disappeared. At first, no one understood what had happened. But within hours, panic spread. Clothes were found on the beach. Search parties began combing the shoreline. Rescue teams entered the water. The assumption was immediate and heartbreaking. People feared she had drowned. News of the disappearance spread rapidly across the country. Newspapers rushed to print special editions. Radio reports interrupted regular programming. Followers gathered at Angelus Temple to pray. Thousands believed their beloved evangelist had been lost at sea, yet the mystery surrounding her disappearance would soon deepen in ways no one expected. Because just when the nation began mourning her death, something impossible happened. After weeks of searching, Aimee Semple McPherson suddenly reappeared, alive, and with a story that would ignite one of the greatest religious controversies of the 20th century. But the question that followed her return would divide the nation. Was it a miracle of survival, or the beginning of an elaborate deception? To answer that question, we must look closely at what she claimed happened during the day she vanished. In May of 1926, the fame of Aimee Semple McPherson had reached extraordinary heights. Her church was flourishing, her radio broadcasts were expanding her influence, and thousands still packed Angelus Temple every week to hear her preach. To many Americans, she had become a symbol of modern revivalism. A woman preacher who could fill arenas, a healer whose prayers were believed to bring miracles, and the founder of the rapidly growing International Church of the Foursquare Gospel. But on May 18, 1926, everything changed. That afternoon, Aimee decided to visit the beach in Southern California. It was not unusual for her to take time away from the constant pressure of ministry to rest and pray near the ocean. The shoreline had often been a quiet place for reflection. According to those who accompanied her that day, she walked along the sand and eventually moved toward the water. Some witnesses later recalled seeing her swim out into the ocean. At first, nothing seemed unusual, but after some time passed, concern began to grow. She had not returned. Her companions scanned the waves. They searched the shoreline, but there was no sign of her. Soon, alarm spread. When her clothing was discovered left behind on the beach, the fear became immediate and overwhelming. The assumption seemed obvious. Aimee Semple McPherson had drowned. Rescue teams were called in quickly. Lifeguards began searching the water. Boats combed the surrounding area, while volunteers walked along miles of coastline, hoping to find some trace of her. But the ocean revealed nothing. The news spread rapidly. Within hours, newspapers across California were reporting the shocking disappearance. Soon the story reached the entire nation. For millions of people who had followed her ministry, The possibility of her death felt devastating. At Angela's temple, crowds gathered in silence. Some prayed, others wept openly. Services turned into vigils. Her followers believed they had lost the woman they saw as a powerful instrument of God. Search efforts continued day after day. Divers entered the water repeatedly. Boats dragged the ocean floor. Hundreds of volunteers joined the effort, yet no body was ever recovered. Weeks passed. Gradually, hope faded. Authorities began to assume that the ocean had claimed her. Many newspapers prepared memorial articles describing the extraordinary life of the famous evangelist. But then, just as the nation was beginning to accept her death, something impossible happened. 5 weeks after the disappearance, on June 23, 1926, Aimee Semple McPherson suddenly reappeared, not in California, but in a small town hundreds of miles away. She was found in Douglas, Arizona, near the Mexican border. The news shocked the entire country. How could a woman believed to be dead suddenly appear alive weeks later? And where had she been all that time? When questioned, Aimee told an extraordinary story. She claimed that while she had been on the beach in California, she had been approached by a couple who asked for help finding a sick child. According to her account, she followed them to their car, believing she was going to pray for the child. But instead of helping someone in need, she said she had been kidnapped. She described being forced into the vehicle and taken across the border into Mexico. For weeks, she claimed, she was held captive by her abductors. She later described being kept in a small shack in the desert. She said her captors intended to hold her for ransom, but eventually, she managed to escape. According to her story, she slipped away from her kidnappers and began wandering through the desert in an effort to reach safety. The journey, she said, was brutal. She claimed she walked 4 hours under the intense desert sun. She suffered dehydration. She became disoriented. But eventually she found her way to a nearby settlement. That settlement was Douglas, Arizona. From there, she contacted authorities and arranged to return to California. When the news broke that she had survived, her supporters rejoiced. Many believed they had witnessed a miracle. The woman they had mourned was alive. And her story seemed like something out of a dramatic adventure. But not everyone was convinced. Almost immediately, questions began to emerge. Reporters started investigating the details of her story. Some journalists noticed inconsistencies. Authorities began asking difficult questions. Why had there been no ransom demand? Why had no one reported seeing suspicious kidnappers? Why had weeks passed without any confirmed evidence of her captivity? Even more troubling, some witnesses began offering alternative accounts. One of the most controversial claims came from people who believed they had seen Aimee during the weeks she was supposedly missing, and not in Mexico, but in California. Rumors began circulating that she had spent that time in a small seaside town called Carmel. According to these rumors, she had been there with a man named Kenneth Ormiston. Ormiston was a radio engineer who had worked with her ministry. Some investigators began exploring the possibility that the disappearance had not been a kidnapping at all. Instead, they wondered whether it had been a secret romantic getaway. If that were true, it would mean that the dramatic story of kidnapping and desert escape was a fabrication. The possibility created a media storm. Newspapers printed sensational headlines. Public opinion began to divide sharply. Her followers defended her passionately. They believed she had been the victim of a real crime. But skeptics grew louder. They believed the story simply did not make sense. Authorities launched an official investigation. Witnesses were questioned. Hotel records were examined. Phone calls were traced. Every detail of the disappearance became the subject of intense scrutiny. For the first time in her career, Aimee Semple McPherson found herself at the center of a national scandal. And the mystery of her disappearance was no longer just a strange story. It was becoming a legal battle, a battle that would place her on trial in the court of public opinion. And possibly in an actual courtroom, because prosecutors were beginning to consider a shocking possibility. What if the famous evangelist had staged the entire disappearance herself? If that were true, the consequences could be devastating. Her reputation, her ministry, everything she had built, all of it could collapse. But as investigators dug deeper, the story became even more complicated. Because for every piece of evidence that seemed to challenge her story, there was another detail that seemed to support it. And the truth behind what happened during those missing weeks would remain one of the most puzzling mysteries in American religious history. A mystery that would soon explode into a courtroom drama watched by the entire nation. When Aimee Semple McPherson returned to California for her mysterious disappearance in 1926, she expected relief, celebration, and perhaps sympathy. At first, she received exactly that. Thousands of supporters gathered to welcome her home. Crowds surrounded Angela's temple, praising God for what they believed was a miraculous survival. For many of her followers, there was no doubt about her story. She had been kidnapped, she had endured suffering, and she had escaped through divine strength. But beyond the walls of Angela's temple, the reaction was far more skeptical. Newspapers had already begun examining the details of her story with intense scrutiny. Journalists compared timelines. Investigators interviewed witnesses. Authorities looked closely at every claim she had made about the kidnapping and her supposed captivity in Mexico. And the deeper they looked, the more complicated the situation became. One of the central figures in the growing controversy was Kenneth Ormiston, a radio engineer who had previously worked with her ministry. Rumors began circulating that Ormiston had disappeared around the same time Aimee vanished. This detail immediately attracted the attention of investigators. If both individuals had been missing during the same time period, it raised an uncomfortable possibility. Had they been together? The rumor spread quickly through newspapers across the country. Some reporters claimed that witnesses had seen a woman resembling Aimee staying in a cottage in the California town of Carmel during the weeks she had supposedly been kidnapped. Others claimed that Ormiston had rented a nearby property around the same time. If those reports were true, the implications were enormous. It would suggest that the entire kidnapping story might have been invented. A scandal like that could destroy her reputation overnight. Authorities soon began building a case. Prosecutors examined hotel records, rental agreements, and travel logs. They questioned witnesses who believed they had seen Aimee during the period of her disappearance. Some claimed the woman they saw strongly resembled the famous evangelist. Others were less certain. Still, the speculation grew louder. Eventually, the situation escalated into formal legal action. Prosecutors began considering charges of conspiracy and filing false reports. The claim was shocking. They suspected that Aimee Semple McPherson had have staged her disappearance. If proven true, it would mean that the dramatic kidnapping story had been fabricated to cover up something else. The possibility of a public trial quickly captured national attention. By that point, Aimee was one of the most recognizable religious figures in America. Her sermons had reached millions through radio. Her church was filled weekly with thousands of believers. And now, she faced the possibility of criminal charges. The media frenzy intensified. Newspapers published daily updates. Editorials debated her credibility. Some writers portrayed her as a religious fraud. Others defended her passionately. Public opinion became sharply divided. Her supporters believed she was being persecuted because of her ministry. They argued that powerful forces were trying to destroy her influence. Many insisted that she had truly been kidnapped. They believed the accusations against her were cruel and unjust. Meanwhile, critics saw the situation very differently. They believed the inconsistencies in her story were too obvious to ignore. They questioned why no ransom demand had ever appeared. They asked why there were no confirmed witnesses to the alleged kidnappers. They pointed to the rumors about Carmel and Kenneth Ormiston. and they wondered whether the dramatic desert escape story had been carefully crafted to explain a personal scandal. The investigation moved forward. Witnesses were called to testify. Evidence was presented. Reporters packed the courtroom. Every detail of the case was followed closely by the national press. One of the most dramatic aspects of the proceedings was the emotional intensity surrounding the testimony. Some witnesses claimed they were certain they had seen Aimee in Camel. Others said the identification was mistaken. Defense attorneys challenged the reliability of these accounts. They argued that the witnesses might have confused her with someone else. Meanwhile, Aimee herself remained firm in her story. She insisted that she had been kidnapped. She described again the ordeal of captivity and the exhausting journey through the desert after her escape. Her supporters believed her unwavering testimony was proof of her honesty. They saw her as a victim of both crime and unjust accusation, but the pressure of the investigation was enormous. The case was not only a legal matter, it had become a national spectacle. Every development was reported in newspapers across the country. Cartoonists drew satirical illustrations. Radio commentators discussed the case with fascination. For weeks, the question dominated headlines. Had America's most famous evangelist been kidnapped? Or had she staged the entire event? Then something unexpected happened. As prosecutors continued examining the evidence, their case began to weaken. Some key witness statements became uncertain. Certain timelines did not align as clearly as investigators had hoped. The evidence that might have proven conspiracy began to fall apart under closer scrutiny. Gradually, prosecutors realized that proving their accusations beyond doubt would be extremely difficult. And in a case watched so closely by the nation, uncertainty could be disastrous. Eventually, the charges were dropped. Legally, Aimee Semple McPherson was cleared. She was not convicted of staging the disappearance. She returned to her ministry without a criminal record, but the controversy did not disappear. In fact, the questions surrounding the case would linger for decades. For some people, the dropped charges confirmed her innocence. They believed she had been falsely accused and had endured tremendous injustice. For others, the lack of a conviction did not settle the mystery. They believed the truth might never be fully known. The public debate continued long after the legal case ended. And although Aimee resumed preaching and leading her church, the shadow of the disappearance never completely faded. It had become part of her legend, a story filled with unanswered questions. Yet despite the scandal, something remarkable happened. Her ministry survived. Angela's temple continued filling with worshippers. The International Church of the Foursquare Gospel continued expanding, and Aimee Semple McPherson continued preaching to thousands. But the dramatic events of 1926 had permanently changed how the world viewed her. She was no longer only known as a healer and revivalist. She had become one of the most controversial religious figures of her era. Yet even with controversy surrounding her name, her influence on modern evangelism would prove impossible to erase. Because the movement she built was still growing, and the legacy she left behind would shape the future of global Christianity in ways few people could have predicted. After the storm of controversy surrounding the disappearance case began to settle, Aimee Semple McPherson faced a crucial moment in her life. Her reputation had been shaken. Her personal story had been debated across newspapers, courtrooms, and churches throughout the United States. For many public figures, such a scandal might have ended their career completely. But Aimee Semple McPherson was not easily defeated. Instead of retreating from public life, she returned to what she believed was her calling, preaching, and almost immediately, the crowds began returning. Week after week, thousands continued filling Angela's temple in Los Angeles. Despite the questions that lingered about the disappearance, her supporters remained fiercely loyal. To them, the controversy had not diminished her spiritual authority. If anything, it strengthened their belief that she had endured persecution because of her faith. Inside the temple, The energy of the services remained powerful. Choirs sang with the same intensity, prayers for a healing continued, and Aimee's sermons still carried the dramatic storytelling style that had first captured the attention of the nation. But the work she was building extended far beyond a single church building. The movement she founded, the International Church of the Foursquare Gospel, continued expanding across the United States and eventually around the world. Churches affiliated with the Foursquare movement began appearing in cities, towns, and rural communities. Missionaries traveled internationally. The message she had spent years preaching continued spreading long after the headlines about her disappearance faded. One of the most remarkable aspects of her legacy was her role as a pioneer. In an era when female religious leaders were still rare and often discouraged, Aimee stood on some of the largest stages in American Christianity. She preached to audiences that sometimes numbered in the thousands. She managed a large religious organization. She operated a radio station. And she became one of the first evangelists to understand the enormous potential of mass media. Long before modern televangelism existed, she had already discovered how technology could amplify a message of faith. Radio broadcasts allowed her sermons to travel far beyond the walls of Angela's temple. People who had never met her personally still felt connected to her ministry through the sound of her voice carried across the airwaves. In many ways, the strategy she pioneered would later become standard in modern religious broadcasting: large-scale evangelistic events, media outreach, highly organized church networks. These ideas were revolutionary at the time, and they helped shape the future of global evangelical movements. Yet despite the expansion of her ministry, the mystery of the 1926 disappearance never completely vanished. For decades, historians, journalists, and researchers continued debating what really happened during those missing weeks. Some firmly believed her kidnapping story. They argued that the investigation against her had been influenced by public prejudice against a powerful female preacher. Others remained skeptical. They pointed to the unresolved questions surrounding Kenneth Ormiston and the rumors of Carmel. But without definitive evidence, the case remained unresolved. The truth behind the disappearance became one of the most famous unsolved mysteries in American religious history. What is certain, however, is that the controversy did not stop the momentum of her work. Through the late 1920s and into the 1930s, she continued leading revival meetings, overseeing church operations, and expanding the Foursquare movement. Her influence reached beyond religious communities. She became a cultural figure whose life reflected the tension between faith, celebrity, media, and public scrutiny in modern America. And yet, behind the public image, her life remained demanding and exhausting. Years of constant travel, preaching, administration, and media attention placed enormous pressure on her health. Still, she rarely slowed down. She remained committed to the mission she believed God had given her. Then, in 1944, her remarkable and controversial life came to an unexpected end. Aimee Semple McPherson died in Oakland, California, at the age of 53. The official cause of death was listed as an accidental overdose of sleeping medication. Her sudden passing shocked her followers. Thousands mourned the loss of the woman who had once filled stadiums with her voice and built one of the most influential revival movements of her era. Even after her death, the church she founded continued to grow. Today, the International Church of the Foursquare Gospel has thousands of congregations worldwide, reaching millions of believers across continents. The organization she began in the early 20th century remains active in missions, community outreach, and evangelism. Her influence can still be seen in modern megachurches, large revival events, and religious broadcasting networks. Many of the methods used by contemporary evangelists can be traced back to ideas she pioneered nearly a century ago. Yet despite her lasting influence, the fascination with her life has never faded. Books have been written, documentaries have explored the mystery, Historians continue studying the dramatic events of 1926 because the story of Aimee Semple McPherson is more than a biography. It is a story about the power of faith in an age of media. A story about a woman who challenged expectations. A story filled with miracles, controversy, devotion, and unanswered questions. And perhaps that is why her life still captivates people today. Because in many ways, she lived at the intersection of two worlds. The world of spiritual belief and the world of public spectacle. Some remember her as a woman of deep faith who brought hope. Others remember her as a controversial figure blurring ministry and performance. But regardless of where someone stands, one fact remains. Aimee Semple McPherson changed the landscape of modern evangelism. Her voice echoed across radio waves. Her sermons filled massive crowds. Her church became the center of a global movement. And her mysterious disappearance ensured that her name would never fade quietly into history. Nearly a century later, the question still lingers. What truly happened during those missing weeks in 1926? Was it a dramatic survival story, or a mystery that will never be solved? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. Her life remains one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of modern Christianity. The story of Aimee Semple McPherson refuses to fade because it sits at the crossroads of faith, fame, and mystery. Was she a genuine vessel of divine power, a misunderstood pioneer, or a figure caught between truth and controversy? In the end, her story reminds us how powerful belief can be and how elusive the full truth sometimes is. If this story intrigued you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. And drop a comment below. What do you think really happened?